The locomotive of history. That was a phrase used by Trotsky to describe war and the effect it has upon the development of history. And I found it quite an interesting phrase, and I think it's pretty much apt for this particular talk because of the importance of railways on the Western Front. So I'm going to look at railway development on the Western Front, predominantly from the British point of view. I will hold my hands up and say that I am an Anglophile when it comes to the Western Front, and I'll move on. To begin with, I'm going to give an intro blurb, which I'm sure some of you have seen before, but always bears reiterating. And that is the nature of the First World War, that it was a mass industrial war. It used the products, the processes and the principles of the mass industrial society from which it came and from the Second Industrial Revolution. And it's about applying these in the most efficient and effective way possible. When soldiers on the Western Front complained about being cogs in a machine, they weren't necessarily talking metaphorically. They were cogs in a machine because this was the production machine of war. It is a war of systems and of systems, of integrated elements of the armed forces all working together, and they are interdependent, just as they are back home in the United Kingdom. It is also a war increasingly of management and administration as well. One of the problems facing Haig, for example, was not only did he have to be a commander in this most strange and unique of wars, he also rapidly had to become an excellent administrator and manager, as well as politician as well. There's a nice little poem here written by an unknown ROD officer, which stands for Railway Operating Division Officer, so I thought that was rather appropriate. But times of luxury and bump have killed the days of yore, where well may the philosophic sage view with disgust this gilded age of stationary war. Stationary, not as in standing still, but stationary as in the enormous amount of forms that needed filling in. Now, railways were the primamobile of Western civilization. Primamobile, Latin for prime mover. Initially, this was a philosophical term, and again, it's very appropriate and apt for the referring to railways in the First World War. It describes an initial agent that is the cause of all things. It was used by Aristotle in metaphysics. Later, it's used to describe any machine that generates energy from fuel into mechanical motion. That is, it takes fuel, which is a prime element, and turns this into mechanical motion, into movement. And in the case of the railways of the early 20th century, these two definitions are both very apt. I was trying to think of a way of saying, how do we describe the influence of railways on the Western Front? Because they don't really appear, they're not particularly exciting. You know, the focus, if you watch 10 hours of TV on the First World War, you may see a few minutes of railways, but you'll always see enormous amounts of infantry, artillery, machine guns, and battle, of course, things exploding. These are the quiet things that sit behind the line. But in terms of importance, the railways should be thought of as pretty much like gravity. Yeah, an extraordinarily powerful force that you take no notice of until it's not there. And so I think that describes this as the prime mover of Western civilization in the 19th and earliest 20th century. Nothing works without the railways. Everything is supplied by the railways. Now, there's been a lot of thought pre-war, especially after the German victory in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War and its use of railways then. France was very much aware of the military importance and potential of its rail system. And, accordingly, it introduced a dual control arrangement whereby the railways remained in private hands and a shadow military organisation was formed. On the outbreak of any war, the military would take direct control of railways in the army zone, while the interior zone remained in the hands of civilians, though overseen by the military. So you have a militarised, state-organised, private system which can be taken over and has a definite structure which includes both the military and the civilians. Like the Germans, the French invested very heavily in military track and infrastructure. There was an enormous boost in railway building in this part of the world, especially after the defeat in 1870, so that it could never happen again. Many of those railway lines heading towards German border. Now Germany, it too had been deeply impressed by the potential of railways in 1870, and also when it viewed the war in 1905, also the Japanese War. And so therefore their mobilisation system, along with France's, was developed after that. Rapid railway mobilization was an integral part of Germany's Schlieffen Plan, its strategic plan to defeat the French in the west before turning around and dealing with the Russians in the east. And itself was based upon speed of mobilization, the perceived speed of mobilization of its potential enemies. Now, Germany effectively nationalized its railways by imposing direct or indirect state control, one way or another. It has a particularly peculiar system because it's a Länder system. So these were nominally private railways, but in fact they were pretty much state-stroke military control, because when we say the state in Germany at this particular time, we mean military. They created centralized administration, and they imposed standard operating procedures on those railway companies as well, whether they wanted to operate them or not. And that development was dominated by the military. We can see that, for example, because all German locomotives were to have detachable tops so they could clear the low French bridges, a problem that they found in 1870. If I was French, and if I was visiting Germany in the interwar period and I was watching these being constructed, I think I might have been extremely worried about this. Oops. Britain went its own way, unsurprisingly. We had the largest, the most developed rail network capacity in the world. I say both capacity and network because we also had capacity to produce locomotives, produce everything to do with railway infrastructure and manufacturing. Its development was driven solely by commercial concerns. There were hundreds of competing companies. There was no standardization of equipment or methods, which varied from company to company. And the British rail network was developed much earlier than the others, which means that they're somewhat ignorant of the latest construction techniques and technologies that are being tried out in other parts of the world. British military rail experience was gathered mostly from its small wars and, most importantly of all, the Boer War. And perhaps the main lesson that was gathered from the Boer War is avoid the centralization of your railways. They must be decentralized in order to be able to react flexibly to military issues. The British railway needs, therefore, in terms of a future conflict in France or Flanders, were really centred around mobilisation in Britain itself. We've got a diagram there which gives you some idea, at least, of just how much expansion took place. Even between some of those 1876 and 1914, we can see the density of rail increasing dramatically. So it's about mobilisation in Britain. Now, when it was planning its deployment, the BEF, Britain focused on two principal elements. And that was, how do we get state control? And how do we inculcate the military into this? Well, state control of British Railways was gotten through Section 16 of the rather obscure Regulation of Forces Act 1871, which, if you read Section 16 in a particular light, gives the government effectively complete control over the railways if necessary. Now, the former, as I said, was achieved through 16, but the latter required cooperation between the military, politicians, and the railway companies themselves. And this was exercised through the formation of the Railway Executive Committee in 1912. This process had really begun way back in 1876, but it was only in 1912 that a serious proper committee was formed. It contained representatives of the military, government, and the 10 major British railway companies. And this created much closer practical understanding and cooperation at the all-important technical level by bridging the gap between the military and the commercial worlds. If you want to read more about this, there's copies of Stand 2 up there, the bulletin, which I wrote about British railway mobilisation. We've got to say some of the characters involved in the Railway Planning Committee. Sir Guy Granite of Midland Railways, who will go on to be Director General of Movements and Railways in Britain. Sir Sam Fay, who will go on to be his deputy at a later point. Herbert Ashcombe Walker, who was the chairman of this committee. And Sir Francis Dent, whose involvement in the war would become extremely intimate. Regards France, because once we've hopped over the channel, we have to consider the rail issues there. Well, the BF made absolutely no provision for either operation or construction of railways in France. The pre-war Anglo-French agreement dealing with this stipulated that France would provide for all of the BF's railway needs upon request. Now, the BF have taken some degree of flack and criticism for this, but one can see it from their point of view. Their only requirement was to provide some bilingual railway transport officers, or RTOs, just to superintend the in-training and detraining. The reasons why are quite simple. It's a small army to begin with. Britain's navy was going to be our main contribution to any future war, not its army. We were expecting a short war and a very mobile war. In fact, the BEF was designed around mobility. Even if we look at something like the 18-pounder carriage, it's designed specifically to be lightweight in order to increase mobility. If we look at the choice of caliber of 18-pounder, the reason for that is it's the best balance between a light shell that can actually do some damage as well. Everything is focused around mobility. And to enhance that even further, the BEF included motor transport in its modernised supply chain. So, when we look at it from that point of view, there isn't really much need for Britain to be involved in the railway movements that on French lines that the French understand using French rolling stock and French locomotives. It would have actually, in effect, as far as they were concerned, caused problems if we were to do that. Now, I'll talk about the BEF supply chain and integration. You cannot look at any element of transportation, in fact, any element of the war itself, on its own, in isolation. It's an integrated war. And the use of their motor transport between the railhead and refilling point was actually an extremely good idea. Though, again, many other commentators, especially those who favour rail, tend to look askance at the use of motor transport. The crucial juncture between the railhead and the refilling point, which I'll explain in a minute, really differentiates between two worlds. Now, just to quickly go through them, the base port, the chain. Supplies are unloaded and moved to the transit depot, which is usually the quayside. From the transit depot, supplies are loaded in bulk for rail movement to following depots at the advanced base. The advanced base will be located on the railway for a supply of field units, and eventually those trains will end up at a regulating station. Now, the regulating station were these vast railway interchanges containing hundreds of sidings where bulk equipment, bulk supplies were broken down into individual supplies and made up into specific trains. From there, those trains will go to the railhead, and the railhead exists where the bombing begins, where the fighting begins in effect. Its location was supposed to be at the point just further on from the last point that the furthest range German shells can land. So it sits just behind where the action is. In front of that, where fighting is the norm, it's a fluid area that's subject to continual action. So it demarks two worlds, very much, a fighting world and a non-fighting world. It also, effectively, is the demarcation point between the world of the civilian and also the world of the military. It is the military who will run railways in front of the railhead itself later on. Now, the use of motor transport was very, very simple. Horse transport, which is the normal means of distribution from the forward area, has a radius of action of about 7 miles. So effectively, you are tied to your railhead. Whereas, if you use motor transport, and insert that into the equation, this dramatically increases mobility and therefore independence, because you can be up to 30 miles ahead of your railhead and still have the ability to supply. And in turn, that also increases the flexibility of rail provision as well, because there isn't the immediate need to deal with a problem when it's only 7 miles away from the railhead. It gives you an extra amount of elasticity and therefore amount of time in which planning your rail provision as well. Generally speaking, at the railhead, it was transshipped from lorries, rail rather, as we see in this photograph, into lorries, was then taken to a refilling point where it's picked up by horse transport and then distributed to units. This is a perfectly viable system in the early days, though later on, when we see a multiplication of types of supplies and new types of supplies and in much increased heavier shells as well, and guns, then we see the need to increase or expand the transport system still further. 1914, the paradox of the railways in 1914, what the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, or rather what the railways giveth, the railways take away. Railways allowed all the belligerents to mobilise rapidly. They all based their plans on. In fact, success was deemed to be he who mobilises first will win. Since they all have rail systems with which to mobilise, none really have any significant advantage over the other. They're all mobilising at a rapid pace, about an equal pace, in fact. The destruction of the Belgian rail system did work in favour of France, though, because it hampered German movement and it diverted their resources. I don't know if any work has been done, I don't think so, on the effect of the destruction of the Belgian rail system had upon the movement of the troops in the Schlieffen Plan. But the net result of that, as we all know, is that the Schlieffen Plan failed to envelop Paris, moved in front of Paris, and therefore we end up with a situation where we get a breathing space, which leads to the Battle of the Marne, and eventually we end up also with stalemate. After the Marne, we get to the race to the sea. And again, it's the railways that allow the French and the Germans to move large numbers of troops to counter each other. And as we can see, there is no particular decision at any point on these series of battles heading further and further and further north. The loss of Amiens at the end of August was probably the biggest problem that the BEF faced and, in terms of railways, because it is the colossal yard, it's the main base and it's the main regulating station for the BEF. That caused enormous amounts of worries, and there was enormous sigh of relief when it was recaptured in September. We'll see this repeated again, one way, in one form or another, in 1918. So, even later on, when the Indian Corps came from Marseille, they could be moved into position quickly because of the railways. One of the bigger problems was the loss of the French coalfields. Railways are the prime mover, and they use coal. Lots and lots and lots of coal. The coal issue was something that would not go away for the BEF and for the Ministry of Munitions, and throughout the war there was always a problem with coal, because, of course, coaling ships were subject to attack by German submarines and German flotillas, so therefore an awful lot of coal had to be diverted from the coastal routes onto the railways in Britain. And France had to be supplied, not only with the BEF's coal needs, but also with the French coal needs. And the BEF finds itself beginning to face increasing railway problems, though nothing else to the problem that we're going to get later on. One of the problems they've got is that we have a chap called the Inspector General of Communications. Now, he is separate from the Quartermaster General, and he is in charge of the lines of communication, and that also includes the tactical use of trains and the link between the motor lorries and the train. The problem is that the Inspector of General Communications is located at the base, which for Britain at that time is in Rouen. But the action is happening around Paris and then later on further north. And it's only really the Quartermaster General and GHQ that can react quickly. To give some credit to the British, they did leap on this fairly immediately. The Quartermaster General was given tactical control of where rail should go, and then while the IGC itself was restricted to coordinating with the French for the provision of those trains itself. So, by the end of 1914, we're in a strange position. The railways haven't broken down, but we've identified some issues and problems with them. However, we're also dealing with those in an ad hoc basis. There's no overall view of how railways should develop, because there is no overall view yet of how the war should develop. The general consensus of opinion, even at the end of 1914, is that it will still be a short war, and therefore there's no real need to tinker with anything. The advent of trench lock begins to change this, though it'll take time to come through. It increases demand from all sides for more. More is the best way of describing it. Material, men, guns, shells, shoelaces, boots, everything you could possibly need, as well as lots of new classes of material coming in because of the trenches that are being constructed. It also creates the static conditions required by the railways to meet those demands as well. Again, it's the paradox of the railway. Britain and the BEF have a long way to go, in particular, as the army and industry begin to expand and rationalise. I'll put the phrase in there, including railway companies, because it's interesting to note that when the first demands for more start trickling through in October of 1914, it is the railway companies that have the spare capacity in Britain itself to provide those. These included demands for gun carriages. What else do we have? We have also demands for stretchers, rather chillingly, which a lot of those were made up in Crewe, and also the beginning of demands for prosthetic limbs, because it was the railway companies who had the experience of producing and manufacturing these due to the number of accidents on the railways. However, ultimately, it's the boiling frog effect which dominates thought, concept, and development. You all know the boiling frog experiment, where the frog is placed inside of, if you place a frog inside of a pan full of boiling water, it will leap out immediately, where if you place the frog in a pan of cold water and then boil it up slowly, the frog will happily sit there enjoying its sauna. Why anybody wishes to go around boiling frogs at all, whether they come from, I do not know. But the boiling frog effect is what is happening here. It will take time before the full entity is really understood. So the transport implications are only gradually recognised in increments by a fairly decentralised system that encourages a fairly narrow view. So even where you do recognise problems, they are dealt with on a kind of departmental basis, a very narrow basis. And the full picture and the full implications simply doesn't construct itself yet. A lot of this is the legacy of South Africa, where there was a big deal of argument between a centralised transportation supply system or a decentralised one. Again, this will come to the fore somewhat later. Even so, there was a little concern in some quarters, and some ad hoc fragmented steps were taken to address some of the more immediate issues. We've seen one already, which was the change in the role of the Inspector General Communications, but also we have as well the Girard Report, the formation of the Railway Operating Division, the problem of the increasing degradation of French railways, the Bassin-Loubet experiment, sounds quite interesting, and Mr. McDoodle and the 1st Battalion of the Canadian Overseas Construction Corps. Now, all of these are effectively the seeds of something which will grow into an enormous organisation by 1916, 1917. It begins with the Girard Report, which is effectively somewhat ahead of its time. In December 1914, Sir Percy Girard, remarkable chap, he was a Canadian rail engineer, started off life working for the Canadian Pacific Railroad in Maine, of all places. Was brought in to rationalise the railways in South Africa, which he did by centralising them, much to the chagrin of many British senior officers. Now, this transformation in South Africa ended up actually with his resignation after the Milner there. But the key elements that he used was the insistence on using civilian expertise and a centralised system. The civilian expertise is worked from the fact that this is a technical operation, the running of railways and the building and maintaining of them, not a military one. The military simply lacks the expertise. Secondly, the decentralised position of the British Army in South Africa when it comes to transport means that you have no integration of transport. Everything is compartmentalised. This is quite a familiar sound when he goes to look in December of 1914 to see what he's doing. His concerns are based upon the implications of a long war. And this is something that Kitchener, who's the man who authorised him to go, was very, very concerned about. But as has been pointed out before, he was in something of a minority, as in most of the belligerents were expecting a decision sometime in the first half of 1915. His report findings were the system is far too decentralised. There is a crying out need for civilian expertise. One of his experiences in South Africa was that the military would simply roll out an armoured train as and when they needed, completely ignoring any traffic orders, including other trains on the line. And the military, therefore, are just interested in the action rather than the running of the railways themselves. And there was also a need to take greater control from the French, based upon the fact that if we have more than one line of communications at any further point in the war, if it expands, the French will simply not be able to cope with us. And also we'll need to provide railway operating and support facilities at some point in the future. The report was shelved. And it's an important report because a year later, or rather 2 years later, a very similar report will be done by a chap called Sir Eric Geddes, and its findings, which are broadly the same as Girard's, would be accepted in full. So why was it rejected at this time? Well, ostensibly, there is no real need. He is looking towards a future which may or may not occur, the idea of expansion. On top of that, the BEF have other problems to deal with, and their commanders have other problems to deal with, such as expansion and scratching their heads about how to deal with this new type of war. There are memories of South Africa, where there was a good deal of, so we say, bitterness and bile over the issue of centralisation versus decentralisation. Percy Girard may well have been a member of the military in terms of being a Canadian Royal Engineer, but he was not considered one of the club, most definitely not. And the case was simply that civilians do not understand military needs. What we need is a decentralized system. And one of the biggest cheerleaders for this decentralized transport system was Sir John French, who was Commander-in-Chief of the BEF at that time. Most of the RE staff were vehemently against it, especially R.C. Maxwell, who was the Inspector General of Communications at the time, will go on to be BEF's Quartermaster General. So we have a cabal of our traditional RE staff who are very much against the interference of civilians. We have the reality of a situation where they believe they have bigger fish to fry and an uncertain future. So the report gets shelved and things carry on much as they did. Typical British way of doing things, muddling through. That's our doctrine. Moving on now to the Bassam-Loup Bay experiment, the Railway Operating Division. It's another element that we see which will have ramifications for the future. In January 1915, there was a decision made to form an Army Railways section known as the Railway Operating Department or Division under the Midland Railway Superintendent Cecil Paget. The idea behind that was to maintain a few of the lines that were on Belgian soil, and this was to support a projected advance through Belgium later in 1915. So even then, the planning for this is based around the idea of breakthrough of this being a temporary situation. However, so their use and expansion will become incremental again rather than planned. They will just respond to needs. The factors including, which we'll see them develop into what would be a gigantic organisation, were the building of specific feeder lines for British use. Feeder lines, say, to artillery batteries, which the French say, look, that's not a broad gauge issue, it's not a railway issue really, can you provide for those? And so we start to build our own feeder lines. We start doing it at Boulogne docks as well. We start laying bits of track here and there and start upgrading the Belgian track as well. It's also to provide limited maintenance and construction relief in the BEF area for the French, and also the construction and maintenance of these Belgian lines, so important to a future attack. And the work really starts to begin in November 1915. Now, in the interim, Sir Francis Dent, the South Eastern and Chatham Railway, was invited to operate Boulogne docks. Now, this seems rather odd, given the general anti-civilian position of the BEF, especially the Royal Engineers, the senior Royal Engineers within the BEF. But effectively, it's a stopgap thing. There was a shortage of French dock workers and equipment, and Railway Operating Division troops had not yet been recruited, so we have a hiatus there. Also, the South Eastern and Chatham Railway are used to working with ports. They were the ones that were running Southampton, for example, and all the railway issues there, and were therefore ideal for the job. So he's brought in. They import locomotives, cranes, and they do some rationalisation work as well. However, it must be understood it's a temporary thing. And even though the experiment works very well, they increase efficiency right dramatically, once the Railway Operating Division troops are ready to take over, the experiment ends there. The importance of this is, once again, civilians engaging in a military world. They're already beginning to prove themselves. And it seems rather odd, given the position of the BEF at the time, why Sir Francis Dent, who had no connection whatsoever with the military, he didn't even have a rank, he will do in the future, was asked to do this, where the idea came from. But clearly, the BEF, whilst being broadly anti-civilian, would not so anti-civilian in the sense of being blind about their use. They were prepared to use them in a limited way, where and when necessary. Also in 1915, the Canadians. Canadians are the railway gods of the Western Front. They are the railway supremos of the Western Front, or will be. And their involvement begins in October 1914, when Prime Minister Robert Borden forwarded a suggestion by a chap called Mr. A. McDougall of the Canadian Pacific Railroad for the formation of a Canadian construction battalion. The reason being, if the BEF is in pursuit, which they will be, they will need to build temporary bridges and lines. Why? Because the Germans will, of course, destroy the railway lines and destroy the bridges as well. And I quote from the memo, "In no country in the world can semi-permanent railway structures be built with greater speed than in Canada. This is the result of experience gained in building thousands of miles of railway with the most efficient and modern machinery. The European engineers had very little experience in this class of work, due to the practice in Europe being to always build permanent structures. Canada in particular also benefited from its geographical location because it could benefit from the latest railway technologies that were coming from the United States. And indeed, there was a good deal of close cooperation between the Railways of the United States and also those of Canada. Now, the War Office initially rejects this as simply not necessary in a short mobile war. But after some time, they decide that perhaps the Canadian Overseas Railway Construction Corps may be a welcome addition to their renewed railway operating division. And so the CPR raised 500 men, and they arrived in Flanders in August of 1915. Within less than 2 years, what will become the core of Canadian railway troops will number over 16,000 men from these initial 500, and will be the largest single railway contingent on the Western Front. By comparison, British rail troops will number only about 6,000 compared with this huge effort. The other thing that the Canadians noticed when they arrived here was just how backward the European engineers was, especially the BEF engineers. They were using things like this photograph here, this enormous giant steam shovel. They were using powered concrete mixers, whereas in the Royal Engineers, everything was done by hand in effect. That's not necessarily because they were backwards, they weren't necessarily able to see the leading edges of technology, but considering their background, which is that of an Empire police force, and the relevant engineering work that went with it, construction techniques there simply have to be very simple because the materials required may not be available. Therefore, if you can make your bridge out of low existing stocks of wood, so on and so forth, then you can carry on. But if you require steel spans and you are 2,000 miles away from anywhere, then you're not going to be able to build your bridge. So when we look at that, we see some certain elements beginning to form. We see the first introduction of civilians, even if it's only temporary. We see beginnings of a nascent understanding that we may need to provide some degree of railway support, and therefore the creation of the Railway Operating Division. We see the Canadians beginning to come in and be accepted. They will become a very powerful force. But there's still no overall view of what's going to happen. There's no overall plan. The idea being that this is a short war. So therefore what we've got is what Ian Malcolm Brown called the ad hoc approach. However, in 1916, we see the dramatic decline of trench railways, which led to what you might call the motor transport paradox. Now, the Girard Report sounded some warnings about French ability to provide railway supports, and these warnings were not necessarily rejected. Even those who opposed, such as R.C. Maxwell, echo those early misgivings, though the entity of the French collapse of railway is not even beginning to be hinted at or understood. But by 1916, it is becoming clear the French are unable to meet their obligations. This is due to the fact that we have an awful lot of casualties in the French. French casualties in 1914 and 1915 were colossal, and these meant there was a drain very much on the French railway personnel. Also, we have an expansion of the system and enormous pressure on a railway system which was never really designed at all to deal with these colossal numbers that were coming through. And also we have skimping on maintenance. Because they're under so much pressure, because they're so short-staffed, maintenance begins to decline and we start seeing locomotives breaking down, tracks breaking, water facilities not working, so on and so forth. And this begins a succession of kind of formal and much more likely informal requests from the French for additional aid and support. Again, small, incremental. We have track construction and maintenance, construction of stations, railheads, watering systems. We have a degree of operational support required. Can we borrow some equipment? And above all, can we use locomotives and most importantly of all, rolling stock, wagons. Wagons are used up at a tremendously fierce rate. And without wagons, you cannot move your supplies. The French road system, so as the BF reaches its peak supplies and prepares for the Somme, it attempts to provide some degree of railway relief through this, and also by increasing its use of motor transport. If goods are moving by motor transport, they are not moving by rail, and this provides relief for the rail. So, since the French road system was unable to cope with the motor transport though, if we look at most of the roads involved in France and also in Flanders, these are minor, single-track, rough roads not macadamed, not sealed, and not metalled. They will be just made out of chalk, usually, and it's been compressed, and they're designed for farm traffic, not for thousands and thousands of destructive Thornycroft 3-ton lorries with solid rubber tyres. So, of course, the roads begin to collapse during the assault itself, and the demand for roadstone to repair that soars through the roof. There's only one way to supply that roadstone in such bulk, and that's by rail, which in turn increases the degradation of the rail system itself. They're in a no-win situation. The problem for the BEF is aggravated significantly by its own decentralised system and its consequent compartmentalised narrow views. So we have a situation where the sheer volume of material, combined with the decline in French railways and the lack of maintenance, working with an increased amount, means that you cannot win. The capacity of the system simply cannot cope, and it's compounded by poor administration of that system. And we can see here, somewhat jokingly, that the decline of French railways was of increasing concern to the BEF. As you can see there, that maintenance on that particular carriage has not been done particularly well. Now, in 1916, the whole thing collapses at the Somme. It's simply too much to cope with. Remember, the French are also engaging in large operations themselves at Verdun, which means they have even less personnel to support the BEF. To give you some idea what collapse of transportation means, at Amiens, Britain's main regulating station, there were 16 miles of trains waiting to be unloaded. The ports were absolutely clogged, unable to move anything because of all this material which has been haphazardly unloaded by the workers there. For example, you might find that you need a machine gun. You know, machine gun, Vickers, is in that ship there. Fine. How its tripod is in a ship in Rouen now. Yeah? So there's no coordination, no proper stacking or packing, and just an absolute mess. The roads and rail routes were unusable, they were clogged up. There were shortages of key equipment everywhere, and the fact is that something must be done. We were simply unable, even if we'd have had a success by the late autumn of 1916, we would have been unable to pursue that and carry it on. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, Sir Eric Campbell Geddes. If you like, you can call him Percy Girard Part 2. He's the general manager of the LNER, and he's part of Lloyd George's Ministry munitions team. He's arguably one of the most important people in the war. And he also exemplifies this reality of a civilian war, especially since he's a self-made man who went out there as a young lad, did labouring work, worked at the Waldorf Astoria, cleaning dishes, things like that, was a journeyman, worked on various railways, working his way up in the United States. Now, in autumn 1916, he inspected the entire BEF transportation system, right from port to railhead. Haig is initially very dubious, based upon this reasonable principle of civilians are good at running Blackpool specials on a bank holiday Monday. This is a war. Very, very different thing. However, having listened to the man, talked with him, understood him, he actually supports him when Geddes declares that the transport system is simply not fit for purpose, and he proposed sweeping changes. And these sweeping changes caused an apoplectic fit amongst the traditionalists in the Royal Engineers. Indeed, R.C. Maxwell was about to proffer his resignation over it, and he's relieved somewhat later after he has a fall from a horse, which is a handy way of getting rid of him. But Haig singularly backs Geddes. So, the main changes are, well, you can see the list. It's everything. Ports, docks, storage, distribution, warehousing, construction, operation, provision of rolling stock, construction of rolling stock and maintenance, railheads, road construction, road operation, inland waterways, transport, it goes on and on and on. He also proposed that all this be removed from the remit of the Quartermaster General. At a stroke, the power of the Quartermaster General, and therefore the power of the Royal Engineers to a certain degree, is truncated dramatically. And he formed a centralised transport GHQ under a DGT, or Director General Transportation. That's the Chateau, at least one of them, Chateau de Décolleterie in Montreuil. There was a bit of a joke going on because these people had the most comfortable leatherback chairs in the entire BEF. The reason why is because they were all senior officers, because Geddes brings in all his cronies from the railway industry. Well, these people earn enormous bucks. They're the big star earner at the time. And so in order to give them A, power over the somewhat conservative elements, and B, most importantly, some kind of parity with their position in civilian life, they were all made senior generals, and senior generals have a certain amount of leatherback chairs that they're allowed. And apparently this place was chocker with lovely leatherback chairs. Much more importantly, though, is it provided a central point. And that meant we could finally look at transport in a coherent way and operate it in a coherent way, because everybody who's needed is at a single point under a single man. He also introduces a lot of civilian techniques such as scientific management, including statistical prediction, and that increases the efficiency of the running of the railways dramatically. And so what you get is the creation of a truly integrated transport system. And in that truly integrated transport system, we can see by comparing the Somme in 1916 with the BF in 1917. The Somme, we could barely supply it. In 1917, we supplied Cambrai, we supplied 3rd Ypres, we supplied Arras, and we also supplied Vimy Ridge and Messines itself as well. So the supply element, by this time, is really improved dramatically. Now, just a bit off there. Now then, the French had also themselves, in 1917, decided to say clearly, you will have to look after your own railways, build, construct and provide locomotives for it. This is initially a bit of a big problem because we didn't have the locomotive capacity immediately, but we managed to get a lot of locomotives from the United States. It was a final mission that something needed to be done, and Geddes is there to step in. And one of the most important elements of Geddes transformation is the introduction of light railways. And so I first started looking at light railways, my eyes glazed over. I'm not really interested in the minutiae of 60-centimetre railways, but they are important. They become effectively part of the landscape of France and Flanders in 1917. The reason why is that even though the Geddes reforms had managed to sort out and rationalise transportation from port to railhead, beyond that, still under the writ of the army and the military forces, is an area where it's becoming increasingly difficult to transport anything. The size of that forward area is increasing as the power of artillery increases as well. A new phenomenon known as a devastated zone, which itself is increasing, which is an area utterly destroyed and devoid of any communications, is constantly being created. Motor transport itself is very, very destructive, and it's causing a rather unusual and unplanned for problem, and that is a petrol crisis. Those Thornycroft 3-ton lorries or peerless lorries do about 3.8 or 4 to the gallon. They are not economical, and if we think of 20,000 lorries doing say 60 miles a day, you can see it starts racking up into millions of gallons. So the attempt to push railheads forward to try and eliminate this motor transport link also failed. It simply put the railheads too close to danger. So what to do about this gap and movement across this particular area? The answer was light railways. Now these have been successfully used by the French and the Germans since 1914. We're a bit slow to pick up on that. The Canadian Corps, on their own initiative, had set up their own extremely impressive and very successful system, which became something of a model. If you read First Army reports on this, you'll find that Horn is forever championing, the superlative system of the Canadians. So that particular system acted as an exemplar of what could be achieved. Though I'm not going to go into detail, one might point out the Canadian Corps was a unique organisation with a unique stock of expertise and a unique form of command system. Now the three aims of this particular light railway system was to relieve motor transport, to get it off the roads, to advance across the devastated terrain faster than roads can be built, and to bring up shells and road material. It's hailed as a great success at Messines. Most academics, who actually discuss it at all, agree the system was excellent, and many tonnage statistics are quoted in support of this. The reality, though, is somewhat different. At Messines, the vast majority of ammunition was carried by motor transport, despite the report itself discussing in glowing terms how good it was. In 9 Corps, the plan to eliminate their motor transport and send it to the rear. It was hurriedly called back, and in the event, motor transport carried 75% of its ammunition. There was a very similar situation in 2 Anzac and 10 Corps. the pace of construction was much slower on the roads. You can build a light railway quicker across devastated ground than a road, but that's assuming you're building a proper road with tarmac and all the rest of it. If you're building a temporary road made out of beach slabs, it's much faster to do it that way. On top of that, there was no coherent army-wide system of use of operation. Each corps conceived and operated their light railways in its own way. The key officer that articulates between army and corps is in effect the customer, army is in effect the provider, is a chap called the Corps Light Railway Officer, a CLRO. And these were not appointed to corps. The first appointments didn't happen until September of 1917. 2 Anzac Corps didn't get theirs until December. And that meant that each corps proceeded on its own terms in its own ways. There was no interoperability. There was no coherence to it. And on top of that, light railway was notoriously unreliable regarding time delivery. At 3rd EPA, the service is patchy and declines to virtually 0 by the time we get to October, November. In August, GHQ, there's an MT conference which reveals startling differences between the War Office and GHQ. War Office does not understand why the lorries aren't coming off the road until it's explained to him that your statistics just cover tonnage carried. It doesn't say which tonnage carried, and it includes, for example, the 30% of tonnage that the light railways require for their own construction and maintenance. Another 20% of tonnage which is never delivered because of these time issues and the like. And what happens then is that is then double or even triple counted into the figures because the light railway goes back with its underload, that's counted as a return journey, and then back out again to redeliver. So the statistics are very, very misleading. So light railway does provide some relief, that has to be said, but motor transport is simply too flexible and too useful, and demand continues to increase despite the implication of light railways. I'm going to move rapidly on because he's waving at me like mad, and as usual I've gone over time and all the rest of it. Railways in Defence and Pursuit of 1918. In effect, you could wrap this up quite quickly because it's something of an anti-climax, as it were. To start with, the German Spring Offensive of 1918. We have a number of significant changes that occur at the end of 17. There's the decision to go on to defence, which necessitates a very large infrastructure project for which we do not have enough labour, especially since we have cut infantry establishments down by 25%. Transport is placed back under the QMG in anticipation of a fast-paced mobile war. In practice, this is only done on paper. In reality, it still comes under the writ of the DGT. The speed of the advance of the Germans overwhelms the light railway system, and the railheads are built because they're simply built too far forward, which is a legacy of the offensive position that we'd had before, and also a consequence of the lack of time and manpower in order to move these back themselves. Interestingly enough, Ludendorff failed entirely to understand the strategic significance of Amiens. If he'd have gone straight for Amiens instead of wandering around during March, he could well have won the war, at least forced the Allies to the negotiating table. Let's move on very quickly. In the 100 Days Offensives, again, railways are strategically very, very important. Why? Because of a consequence of a thing I call non-linear sequential bite and hold operations. Bite and hold operations were successful, but they were not cheap, and if you did them in sequence, as we do at 3rd EPA, we find that they degrade very, very rapidly into a mire and into a mess. If we could do these bite and hold operations, but in a non-linear way, a strike here, an attack in the north, then a further one south again, we can keep the enemy off balance and degrade his ability. And it's the railways that provide the capacity and the ability to do that. Witness the move of the Canadian Corps for Amiens in 1918, and then 3 weeks later they're fighting in Albert. We have the closeness of Amiens to the front line itself, which is a very useful thing in the first place in terms of organising everything. There's also been a big railway building operation between May and July of 1918 as we realised how close the Germans had come inadvertently to cutting the country in half in terms of railways. And this railway operation allows the Allies to maintain supply during what was a relatively rapid advance. But by the end of 18, the pendulum is swinging. By October, the BF supply chain is overstretched. Light rail doesn't even get a look in. It's been left far, far behind. It simply cannot keep up with the pace of this advance. The head of steel of broad gauge rail is keeping up with the advance, but railhead construction falls behind rapidly. You can build a railway quite quickly, but building the facilities such as a railhead takes a lot more time. On top of that, we have destruction of the railways by Germans, and also the use of mines, of IEDs, to slow down the rate of construction. Britain has its motor transport, of course, and this saves the day to some degree, because it can bridge the gap between the receding railhead and the increasing front. And indeed, by the time of the armistice, the BF are operating up to 60 miles in advance of their railheads, thanks to the use of motor transport. But there are limits, and motor transport begins to break down, and those rates begin to soar. By early November, the BF suffering significant shortages. The Australians had no underpants. You know, by early, I kid you not, they didn't. More importantly, the Canadians had no rum. So by early November, the BF is suffering significant shortages, not just of underpants and rum, but also of important engineering material, of ammunition, of heavy caliber of shells. And it's the armistice that really saved the Allies' bacon, because we'd reached the point by early November where we simply could not go any further forward. Interesting counterfactual history exercise to ask yourself what would happen if the Germans had hung on for another week or two. I now move to the conclusion, which will make Peter very happy indeed. Very briefly, the BF railway development on the Western Front was remarkable. It really was. The amount of tonnage it handled was colossal. If we consider the machines, for example, the bulk dumping of shells, just shells, nothing else, weighed 144,000 tons. You know, the amount of material that is coming in is incredible, and it's also a credit to the French. They managed to keep things going as well as they did. It's aided very much by Britain's railway experience and the particular experience of the Commonwealth, especially Canada, though later on we also have the Australians and the South Africans as well. The keys to its efficient use were centralisation, suggested by Girard and then put into action by Geddes. Integration, to see the whole thing as a holistic system rather than as separate entities just joined together. The use of modern scientific management techniques, even though these are not particularly welcomed by the more staid Royal Engineers there, and of course the use of civilian expertise, such as the use of a statistical branch, a traffic office branch. Light railways themselves, well, my research on it is pretty negative, but it lacks research generally, so it's the usual cry of more research required. They appear, hesitantly, to be somewhat overrated and were poorly administered, and there was little understanding of the limitations of light railway. I'm beginning to suspect that this was Geddes' particular hobby horse, and therefore was pushed through without the requisite reflection. But the one thing that 1918 did demonstrate, and what the war itself demonstrated, was that that transportation, in this case railways, has now become the ultimate arbor of modern warfare. Thank you very much.
If you want to find the private, please hang it on the old barbed wire.